we should actually instead try to force a buffet of bad options on Putin where he has to make difficult choices. And with those are intrinsic risks. And actually, we are more likely to get to the negotiating table or defeat the Russians on the battlefield if we have to invalidate some of Putin's assumptions, if we have to push Putin to make difficult decisions, which might not decisively break his war machine, but force him to have to make these hard choices. Because Putin, when given hard choices, actually has a pretty iffy track record. He makes mistakes all the time.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Iyame Urmishula, and I have the pleasure of speaking with George Barros, who's the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead at the Institute of the Study of War. George, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with the latest big news that we heard about Ukraine. As the viewers know, U.S. had stopped or paused arms shipments to Ukraine for a few days, but then yesterday we heard that President Trump said that U.S. will resume weapons supply or shipping these weapons. What impact do you think the pause caused? What impact do you think the shipment or resumption will have now?
Right. So the shipment that was paused in Poland by itself was a fairly small shipment, and the delay that it had there probably didn't have a very substantial battlefield impact. Every time that the Ukrainians do not have Patriot interceptors, and there were 30 Patriot interceptors in that pause shipment in Poland, that does degrade Ukraine's ability to intercept, in particular, Russian ballistic missiles. But in terms of the battlefield frontline, fighting, in terms of units' ability to sustain themselves and maintain their tactical frontline positions, I don't think that the pause likely decisively affected that. Now, that's at the tactical level, however. On the strategic level, Ukraine needs substantial military assistance in order to sustain what has become a protracted war. And the reason being is that, look, Vladimir Putin's theory of victory is that the Russians can, in his assessment, overtake Ukraine through not excellence on the battlefield, not through a professional military, but simply outweighing Western support, outweighing Western patience. And the Ukrainians, obviously, in order to be able to get to the negotiating table and not just be ground down, they have to actually reverse some of these Russian battlefield gains. And so that has a presupposed requirement of the Ukrainians at some point in time. They have to conduct some tactical counterattacks. They have to plan some counteroffensive operations to actually change Putin's logic for why he can't just in time seize all of Ukraine, even if it takes many years. That requires, in turn, consistency from the United States in the aid that we provide, but also consistency not just in the quantities, but in the timing. Because as a Ukrainian general, it's exceedingly difficult to actually plan a counterattack, counteroffensive operation if the materials, even if they're small or in transit, you can't rely on them because it's always changing. So it's a good and positive thing that the aid is being resumed. And it seems to me now that the Trump administration is going through a little bit of a reevaluation of its policy on Russian Ukraine. I mean, we just recently had some unprecedented statements from President Trump where I think he's come to realize, after having, through brute force, negotiated with the Russians face-to-face for the past 6 months, realize that the Russians, in fact, are not interested in negotiation. The Russians are committed to achieving their battlefield objectives, and that therefore conflict termination presupposes defeating the Russians on the battlefield. And I'm hopeful, I remain hopeful. I'm not going to use the word optimistic, but I remain hopeful that this administration will start leaning into different policies, which include using the minerals deal to get more weapons sales to Ukraine.
President Trump basically underlined that it will be defensive weapons that are resumed. What does that mean to you? Do you read anything into it?
Look, when we talk about military systems, I really don't like the adjective defensive or offensive, because almost every single weapon system, perhaps with the exception of landmines or maybe like a moat around a castle, can be used in both an offensive and defensive capacity. I think policymakers and politicians tend to like to add those adjectives before words to try to, make it a little bit more palatable. Perhaps if there's a base that doesn't want to do this and he's explaining it's defensive to prevent civilian casualties or lives, that sort of thing, it's really a rhetorical device, which I don't think is particularly appropriate in military studies or military science. That notwithstanding, it tells us that President Trump is indeed going through a policy inflection. He His previous position was that we're not sending more weapons, and that any kinds of weapons that we would send would just be the continuation of the previously approved Biden administration PDA aid. And so now when we have this inflection, which is we're going to send them more weapons, even if he has to put the word defensive there, I mean, that's a good thing.
Do we know what the U.S. is sending to the Ukrainians?
At this time, we don't know exactly, and I'm very eager to see what it is. I believe Axios reported that we're sending 10 Patriot interceptors, and that's just what we know about what's there. Obviously, 10 Patriot interceptors are insufficient for Ukraine's protracted and sustained defense. So I'm hopeful that this will be a reevaluation, and we continue to give Ukraine not necessarily military aid, but sell them aid as military items as foreign military sales.
Russian summer offensive supposedly is underway, and we get different conflicting reports that they are advancing here, they are not advancing there. Ukrainians are taking some territory back. So, what's the latest? Not day to day, but how can you summarize how the summer offensive is going by Russia?
Absolutely. So this summer offensive has definitely been underwhelming, and yes, the summer offensive is underway. The Russians do make small-scale tactical gains every single day. I mean, we're mapping the control terrain, and every day we can verify that the Russians advance a couple hundred meters here, a couple hundred meters there. They seize a field, they seize a village, perhaps a couple villages a week. But this is actually, in terms of the standards and the norms of modern mechanized warfare, a very slow pace. And the attrition rate is not in the Russians' favor. The Ukrainians are successfully inflicting a very high attrition rate on the Russian forces. And so these gains that the Russians make on the map, where they, over the course of weeks and months, they can push the map forward, they are, however, doing that at the expense of destroying Russia's demographic situation and eroding the basis of Russia's economic prosperity and economic stability.
Yes.
And it seems that the current trade-off is not particularly stable or sustainable if we continue keeping the Russians at this current attrition rate.
How about the manpower? Russia has not had any major large-scale mobilization. We saw it in the fall of 2022, but since then, it's been basically bribing its own population from some of the poorest regions of Russia. Do you think that's sustainable? It's almost 4 years now, 3.5 years. How much manpower can Russia still generate based on your assessment?
So that's an excellent question. And if I could tell you the exact month or day or hour that it would happen, then this would be very simple. It would simply be an algebra equation for how to outlast the Russians. It's never quite actually that simple because there's a lot of factors that go into that. The biggest and most decisive factor is, what is the attrition ratio? Will the Russians continue to lose what they're currently losing, which is between 30 to 45,000 soldiers killed and wounded per month? Now, if the attrition ratio goes down, perhaps because Western support for Ukraine decreases, or perhaps the Ukrainians become much less effective in their fighting, then the Russian ability to sustain and protract the war will in turn go forward. And so one of the most important things actually to nail down as many of the unknown factors as possible is to just be sure that we can count on, at the current tempo, the Ukrainians are able to extract the very high casualty rates against the Russians. In terms of Russian force generation and recruitment, all of the open source data suggests the Russians are recruiting somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45,000 troops per month, perhaps a little bit higher than that. But as exactly as you noted, Putin is bribing his own population and spending on each volunteer that goes and fights in Ukraine a tremendous, luxurious compensation package, which is fundamentally not sustainable for a long, protracted war. I think this would have been a good model, and it could have been a workable model if you're fighting, the 2-week special military operation, or perhaps a war of a couple months, or maybe even a war of a year, but certainly not a war of 3 years, 4 years, 5 years plus. Look, we could talk about all the economic externalities that the Russian payments have created. I mean, inflation is extremely high because you have a country that's flush with cash due to both just the one-time sign-up bonuses, but also all the other salaries and benefits. You have, so therefore, a very high money supply. You also, at the same time, have a very high interest rate from the Russian central bank at 20%, which should actually really be higher. Of course, this causes problems for the financial and banking classes. Russia's war military industry actually needs to have the cost of capital be lower in order to have the capital availability to continue producing tanks and weapons and things at scale, all the stuff that Rostec is doing. And then, of course, you also have the issue of the labor shortage, because we had, of course, 700,000 Russians flee in 2022 from the initial round of mobilization. You now have an estimated 1 million Russian casualties from the war. Every month, they are losing but recruiting about 45,000 men or so. And the real reality is that, with Russia, with this current labor shortage of about 1 million workers, soldiers, able-bodied men, they can either fight in uniform in Ukraine or they can work in the domestic economy and contribute to GDP. But you can't do both simultaneously, and the dead and wounded do neither. Look, Putin can call another round of mobilization if he really needed to. He really prefers not to do that because it would violate the Russian social contract. But he can. But that will come at the expense of the Russian labor market and the labor pool. He has the option to go and recruit, more workers or fighters from Central Asian countries, or go to the North Koreans. But that also has implications for Russia's own domestic situation. The key thing here is that there really are no good options for the Kremlin. They have to kind of just keep muddling through this issue. And our proposition is as follows. We have insulated Russia from having to face tough decisions because we have refused to put Russia into very precarious positions. We should actually instead try to force a buffet of bad options on Putin, where he has to make difficult choices. And with those are intrinsic risks. And actually, we are more likely to get to the negotiating table or defeat the Russians on the battlefield if we have to invalidate some of Putin's assumptions, if we have to push Putin to make difficult decisions, which might not decisively break his war machine, but force him to have to make these hard choices. Because Putin, when given hard choices, actually has a pretty iffy track record. He makes mistakes all the time.
What would be some of those bad choices, very briefly?
So bad choices. Does he call another round of mobilization and violate the social contract with the Russian population, which is I pay you, I don't force you to fight? That would be a bad choice from the social contract perspective. It would also have a bad choice between prioritization of the labor market and domestic production versus fighters in Ukraine. Obviously, when you pull 300,000 reservists, those people have jobs. I mean, they're not pensioners; they're working somewhere, which causes problems. He also maintains the option of increasing the payments for soldiers to try to increase the volume of volunteers. Right. That has been the historical model that they've gone with. And, we saw in recent months, Samara Oblast offering up to 4 million rubles for a one-time sign-up bonus just to go fight. It's like $40,000. It's life-changing money for the average Russian. It used to be that each individual Russian federal subject would do their own recruiting for their own population, but then they started to open it up and had them compete against each other. So Samara Oblast could try to attract people that were living in Ryazan or Kazan or other oblasts as well.
Let's talk a bit about Iran and the U.S. strikes, Israel-Iran war, U.S. strikes on Iran, and basically weakening Iran from what we had a month ago even. Do you think that has impact on Iran-Russia relations, and particularly their military relations, of course, as it relates to the impact on the battlefield?
Yeah, at this time, no. We have not seen a reduction in Iranian, produced drones, the Shahed 136 drones across the theater. And in fact, some of the most intense Russian strikes with some of the highest number of Iranian sourced drones have been since after the Israeli strikes. And the reason is because the Iranians, through a technology transfer, helped the Russians indigenize the production of these Iranian drones in Russia's Tartarstan region. And so my understanding of those facilities in Tartarstan, they're actually quite self-sufficient. And so when the Israelis damaged a variety of military production infrastructure within Iran that did not degrade the Russian capability, and the Russian capability has been just fine.
Well,
So, really, in hindsight, it's a major strategic mistake that the West did not act sooner to try to prevent the Iranians from doing this technology exchange, because, the Americans can strike what we strike in Iran. We were obviously targeting nuclear facilities. The Israelis can strike things that they want to strike in Iran. But if the Iranians have established and planted production capability within Russia, that's a location that we are politically not willing or otherwise unable to strike.
is it known where those factories are?
Yes, they are known. There's a place in Tartarstan, it's called the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. The Ukrainians actually have targeted it numerous times in the past, so they have damaged some of those facilities, but it's very large and they're protected, and they've been reconstructed and repaired since then. So it's a regular target of the Ukrainian long range strike program.
George, I would like to take this towards the end, but I would like to ask you about your analysis, not prediction as much, but what do you think? Where is this war going? I've heard you say before that you don't think that we will have a ceasefire at the end of this year. Can you elaborate on that more?
Yeah, it's my assessment that this war will continue for a long time because the negotiating positions of the belligerents are too far apart from each other. Having a negotiation presupposes that both sides actually have some common goal that they can work towards in part. And what we see is that the Russian negotiating position officially is you must have regime change in Ukraine, you must have Ukraine deneuter itself, demilitarize itself, and the Ukrainians must cede minimum 4 provinces that the Russians don't fully control. Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Kherson. That is a extreme non-starter negotiating position, because there's no reason for the Ukrainians to cede major population centers and geostrategically significant territory that the Russians don't own and are unlikely to actually seize anytime in the near future, given the very slow rate of Russian advance. The Ukrainian position is, of course, they want to retain their territory, retain a strong military, retain their sovereignty, retain the strategic territory they need to defend the rest of their state. And these are incompatible positions. And so what we've seen over the last 6 months has been an effort on the United States to try to get the parties to negotiate. And even this administration has acknowledged that the negotiating positions are too far apart, that they're not going to get there. And now we seem to have an American reevaluation of the policy vis-a-vis Russia. So, look, we are going to keep fighting the rest of this year. The belligerents will likely keep fighting the rest of next year. And I think it's hard to see the forecast going beyond that, but I'm fairly confident that until we actually change Putin's logic for why he shouldn't just continue doing a slow steamroll of Ukraine, then he will have no incentive to achieve what he wants.
We'll see how this policy development goes on. But my final question to you is more broad and maybe um, a bit pessimistic. But you argue that the world right now is in the stage of 1937, 38. Why do you say that? And sort of what arguments do you have for it?
It's great to have peace, but you need to have all parties involved to want to have peace. And what we see is a world where there are challenges, state challenges to the current world order. We have Putin, who explicitly wants to create a multipolar world order, who seeks to conduct wars of conquest and normalize and legitimize wars of conquest. We have in Beijing Xi Jinping, who is preparing the People's Liberation Army to be able to forcibly seize Taiwan and further reduce and expel American presence from Asia. We have the revisionists in the Middle East when it also comes to Iran and that regime. And what we see with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the effort to try to do a war of conquest, change the borders with might. I mean, this is a referendum on the rules-based international order that we established in 1945. And the aggression is ongoing. Now, the West at this point has not decisively committed to trying to defeat these threats. And what we've seen is there is a coalition, an entente between Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow, where all of these people have different objectives. They have different ideologies, but what they have in common is they want to dethrone the United States. They want to dethrone the international global liberal order. and they are united in that objective. And similarly to what we had in the 1930s, is we had a new string of isolationism, a retreat from wanting to have strong American involvement in the world, um, chronic ignorance and underinvestment in defense capabilities that are necessary to deter and, if necessary, decisively defeat these adversaries. And so we're really at a time for choosing now, where I think war is on the horizon, larger scale war is on the horizon, and we need to act decisively in order to deter it.
George, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Really, really a pleasure.